Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and a very, very warm welcome to this episode. I'm really excited about this one because this is very different from anything we've done before, but equally exciting. I am really grateful for Jo to join us today. Our guest today is Jo Napier, who is a former national newspaper columnist, documentary writer and producer, technology author turned painter. Jo is the founder of the Great Women Portrait Project, which is what we're going to talk about a lot today, which uses portrait art in public and professional spaces to highlight the contributions of women in traditionally male-dominated fields like STEM and finance. Also, a big shout out to Mike Hayes, who helped organize this very interesting episode. So, first question: why are we doing this? Why, we're a science-led company, and why are we doing this episode on art? I think for two reasons. One is, bringing art and beauty or nature into our lives has a great effect on our brains and our creativity. You've probably heard many, many stories in history of how scientists came up with solutions when they let their brains drift, went out in nature, or were doing some artistic pursuit. And secondly, which is where Jo comes in, is the topic can be really inspiring. As we bring stories of women in our fields forward, it can have a great effect. And one of the pieces of research that Jo shared with me was what is called the hidden figures effect. Many of you have probably seen the 2016 film and the book about NASA mathematicians who had a huge contribution. And after that movie came out and was a huge success, there was measurable increase in women pursuing mathematics and physics degrees. At Harvard University, there was a 33% increase in STEM applications from women in the year following the release of this movie. So just a quick example of why art matters and why this subject matters. So, Jo, very warm welcome. Maybe give us a little bit of your background and why you went into this field. What prompted you? Tell us a little bit about your story.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. And thank you to Mike as well for all the great podcast help. My background, as you mentioned, is in journalism. So the first half of my life was spent researching and reporting and covering politics and business, and eventually ended up as a .com or a technology journalist during the .com days. And I essentially wondered, where are the women? I was covering all these kind of key stories back in that very transformative period, and realized I was continually interviewing men who were, shortly after I interviewed them, on the cover of Newsweek or Wired and so on. And I thought, this is a digital landscape taking shape right before our eyes. And I couldn't find any women, or they certainly weren't at the forefront in terms of storytelling.
So then what did you do about that?
So, so what I did was I started to look for them. I started with Anita Borg, who was down in Menlo Park, and basically she started simply a listserv to bring women who were in computing and IT together to talk, to find out what they had in common, what shared concerns and interests, to create a community. And of course, one woman led to another, and that ended up leading to a book for HarperCollins about the digital dozen, as I call them. So women leaders like Geraldine Laybourne, who brought the tech piece to Oprah Winfrey's empire, and Esther Dyson, who was very much at the vanguard of regulation around the internet. And there were women there, they just weren't at the forefront. So I had done a book, or I had done a series of documentaries actually, for that was shown on Discovery Channel and PBS. And so I had a strong awareness of what the ideas and issues and landscape was that was taking shape, and gave me lots of good questions to ask the women when it came time to write the book.
And so tell me about this Great Women Portrait Project, which I believe you launched on the International Women's Day in 2023. So it's in its third year. And sort of your personal story about your baby girl.
Right. So I think everybody has these markers in their lives, that are where you shift. And the big shift for me was becoming a mom to our daughter Julia. And Julia is adopted from China, and of course, everybody wants their daughter to be a great woman or just to realize their gifts and share them with the world. And I thought I should tell her about the great women of Nova Scotia because she will be of Nova Scotia. I was reading her stories about Caillou and Curious George, and I thought, oh, this is such a teachable moment. And so let me teach her about these women. And I had spent many years as a journalist, as I mentioned, and many of them in a Nova Scotia newsroom. And I couldn't think of any great women of Nova Scotia. And I thought, how strange, So I spent, because I was home for the first time ever, I was able to have the time to focus on researching these women. And I went down to the library and I left a little note for the reference librarian and said, can you tell me if you know any great women of Nova Scotia? And of course, that's like catnip to these reference librarians. They had a list of 25 women I'd never heard of. So I started with one, an Indigenous woman who I knew vaguely was a writer, Rita Jo, and one woman led me to the next and to the next, and it became a collection of paintings called the Nova Scotia Nine, which I painted very large scale. And I had a show and presented them, and very strong reaction from women to that show. And I thought that was fascinating, their reaction. It was that women were really hungry for that history. That led to Julia getting a little older and asking to have the closet under our stairs turned into a science lab. And so I thought, okay, well, now here's a great opportunity. I'll put pictures up in the closet of great women of science. And I couldn't think of any. Same problem, except Marie Curie. And I thought, oh, here we go again. My ignorance is my opportunity. So journalists love research. I dug in again. And that's when I decided it was like pulling a thread in a tapestry. I thought, oh my heavens, just one fascinating woman after another I discovered. So I started having great women of STEM portrait shows. Each time I had one of those shows, again, very strong reaction. And it led me to an unsettling insight that we don't know half our history, that men have been the record keepers. And it's just the way it was. And so there's a real gap in our collective consciousness around female history, and that's created a real gap in our perception of understanding that women have indeed made significant contributions to how the world has been shaped, particularly in STEM.
Well, that's and I have a quote that really struck a chord in me from you, which is, when little girls and young women sort of close their eyes and think of inventors or scientists or STEM innovators, you want a female face there too, as they visualize, what their future could be. So that's really, really great because I think, like you said, in our collective conscious, those sort of faces are missing. And yes, we know Mary Curie, but there's just not enough women role models, or they've not been highlighted in history, and a lot of their contributions have been sort of diminished or forgotten. So this project became very successful. I understand it was sort of acquired by the Royal Bank of Canada, and you decided to sort of keep going and expanding this project even further.
Yes, yes. Well, it's funny you talk about quotes. I always think there's a quote that's attributed to Gandhi about, be the change you want to see in the world. I think that's more paraphrasing. I don't know that Mahatma Gandhi actually said that exact phrase, but very much the change I want to see in the world is just what you said. When a girl closes her eyes to imagine an inventor or scientist, to see a female face. And I really thought this is the way I can help contribute to that change. So that first collection of paintings, the Nova Scotia Nine, which was acquired by the Royal Bank, led to more portraits of great women, primarily of STEM. And then in 2023, I thought, okay, I should formalize this into a project. So I gathered 10 women in a boardroom, and the boardroom holds those original paintings, the Nova Scotia Nine paintings. So it was this very female space. It was like a nest of art and history. And the women really responded to that, and they came on board the project in that first year and got the engine rolling. And then the next thing that happened was I got a phone call from Vienna, from the woman who heads up the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, saying, I'm walking through the halls of the Vienna Congress, and it's just one male portrait after another. I've heard about your project. I want to join. And I thought, oh my heavens, this is fantastic. And she brought several female CEOs in from the nuclear energy industry, and they brought 30 male CEOs from all kinds of different energy companies in Canada and in the US. So that really got us rolling.
Should we get into some of your remarkable portraits, and we can show them here on screen, and maybe you can give a little bit about their story. And I'm sure when you made these portraits, you did a lot of research behind them, and their backgrounds and their contributions and so forth. So maybe we can highlight some of that for our audience.
Well, I love that you chose Hertha Ayrton. She's British, but she's also, to quote your first podcast guest of 2025, she was a real likable badass. She was an engineer. She was a player in all these traditionally male-dominated domains. She was a physicist, engineer, mathematician, an inventor, and a suffragette. So when the suffragettes went on hunger strikes, Hertha would bring them into her house. When Marie Curie actually ran into some health and kind of political issues, she took Marie Curie in. So she was a very assertive and kind and brilliant woman who, among her inventions, my favorite one is the Ayrton fan. So during World War I, when mustard gas, Germans were piping mustard gas into trenches to kill soldiers, she didn't have a lab. Her living room was her lab. So on the dining room table, she was playing with matches and little fans and figured out this invention, which was a foldable cotton fan that the soldiers could bring into the trenches and use to fan away the poisonous gas. So she was just, I think, as I say, a real likable badass, to quote Allison.
All right. Who's next?
I think next is Alice Augusta Ball. There we are. I love her story because she died at 24 on New Year's Eve.
Wow.
She was a brilliant Black chemist who, back in the days when if you were struck with leprosy, you were literally arrested and forcibly quarantined in a leper colony. She was born in Seattle, in a kind of a family of photographers. Her grandfather was actually quite a famous photographer, and he taught her the power of creative chemistry. She just became this wonderful chemist who went on to the University of Hawaii to study and take her master's. And she was the first woman and the first African American to graduate from the University of Hawaii. She was asked to come on board because of her brilliance in the field of chemistry, to come on board and try to help solve this leprosy issue, where they knew the chamulgra tree oil had an impact on these folks who suffered from this disease, but they couldn't figure out a way to use it. And she figured out a way to, adapt its components so that it became an injectable solution that changed the lives of people who had leprosy. Basically, it was a treatable scenario then, and people were able to leave the leper colonies and go back home. I mean, can you imagine? It's just, and the tragic thing about, well, two tragedies, I guess, about her story, and why I really love the idea of honoring her, and thank you for showing her today, is that she as I say, she died young from an incident in the lab. She inhaled some poisonous or some gas, and the credit for her discovery was stolen. Basically, the someone at the University of Hawaii who helped to shepherd some of her research, once she passed away, simply took credit for her work. And so it was like for decades and decades and decades, nobody had ever heard of her or knew what she did or knew that the impact she had on people's lives until the year 2000, when somebody had gone through the University of Hawaii records, discovered her papers, and found out that she was indeed the person who came up with the first treatment for leprosy.
So just a question on that. So um, when you're going through some of these records and looking at the stories, do you get angry? Do you feel frustrated that, I just listening to this story, I'm like,
Oh, yeah.
getting annoyed. What emotions do you go through?
I'm emotional just now. I was hoping I wasn't sounding too emotional. Absolutely. I think, this is half our history. This is not just women's history. You know, uh, if we want to really solve the world's problems, we have to see the world whole, not half. And I have three brothers that I love and adore, and they're wonderful. But I don't think they actually believe me when I say that we don't know half our history. And I very much feel emotional about the fact that girls and women in STEM, if they knew the paths that women had paved in these fields, they'd have a real sense of ownership around chemistry in this case. I mean, if they knew Alice's story,
Yeah.
grew up with that story, they'd think, oh, I could be Alice. Young minds engaged in these stories. What a powerful thing, I think.
All right. So our next portrait.
Elsie McGill. Well, Aradhana, you mentioned, do I feel angry or emotional around stories? Elsie is such a fantastic story, and painted her. I painted her portrait large scale. I started to move into a 30 by 40 format, partly because I thought, these women, you'd love to sit next to them at a dinner party. Elsie McGill's a great example of that. During World War II, they were short of fighter planes, and they turned to this 36-year-old aeronautical engineer, and she became the first female aircraft designer. And they basically put her in charge of turning a plant into an assembly line to she designed and retrained the factory staff, and she designed and had them create 60,000 different parts for the Hawker Hurricane airplane, which went on. That plant produced almost 1,500 fighter planes for World War II and helped win the war. So she was a real war hero. She was an advocate for women and children. And when I had her in a show at the art gallery, I went in one day just to do a little focus group. I saw some women looking at the different portraits. There was a portrait of Cecilia Payne, who discovered what stars are made of. Annie Jump Cannon, who came up with the first classification system for the stars still used today. Um, Marie Tharp, who mapped the ocean floor. And Elsie, and the woman who was standing near Elsie, I kind of tapped her on the shoulder and said, what do you think? I'm the artist, and I just would like to get your reaction. And she turned around, Aradhana, and she was crying. And I said, why are you crying? And she said, I never knew any of this. And she would have been a woman in her early 60s. And I thought, yeah, she was basically, I felt saying, she left a note in the book that I left in the art gallery afterwards. She was saying, my life, if I'd seen these possibilities, if I'd known these paths that these women had paved for me, for girls and women, over hard won obstacle, hard won wins to carve these paths. Like I say, you'd have a sense of ownership in these fields. You'd understand that STEM is women's work too, and always has been.
So what are your, aspirations for this project as it evolves in the coming years, and given the amazing feedback you've gotten from folks, what role do you see it playing? hopefully it runs for many, many years more.
Yes, it seems to be gathering momentum each year. So last year, a range of companies came on board. So, for instance, Lockheed Martin now has portraits and prints in all their facilities across Canada. Sanofi Pharmaceuticals, they wanted a portrait of Leon Farrell, who Jonas Saul came up with the polio vaccine, but it was Leon Farrell in Toronto who came up with a rocking machine that enabled the mass production of that vaccine. So it's great these different companies are starting to come on board. What I'm going to do is move now into AI, because I'm trying to find a way to engage the next generation, and technology is very much that tool. So I've teamed up with a young brother-sister team, and they're turning the portraits into speaking portraits. So I take my history, I write a script around an interesting woman, and these can eventually go in science centers or well, we'll see where, but out into the world, so that it's not simply a painting hanging on a wall, but a young person can learn more about the woman by literally hearing what she has to say about her story and her work.
That's amazing. All right. So one of the things we did differently for this particular event is, given the theme, we actually asked our own women. We're actually very fortunate. We have a great male to female ratio in the company, and incredible women who work in all areas of science and business within our company. So we did something different. We actually asked our own women to submit their art and things they do outside of work. And maybe we will share that with our audience in a short animation. Thank you, everyone who shared their work and participated in this. I do know a lot of people who actually are great artists, but did not submit. So I encourage all of you to share your various gifts with your friends and with the world. But one of the things that came out in this, Joe, question for you is this sort of many of the quotes and the reasons why people do this. I read is this connection between the analytical mind and the creative mind, and based on your research into these women in STEM, what have you found about that link, and any insights you want to share there?
Well, I wanted to mention to those women who were kind enough to share their work that I just have to mention that the hands with the tattooed arms, Catriona's hands with their tattooed arms, and Kelly's Bold and Unbothered, and Maria's Fields of Cad Yellow. There's so many I love, but they just stayed with me so strongly. And I wanted to mention to them, speaking of creativity, this is such a fantastic book, The Art Spirit, and it speaks to just what you're asking about there, Aradhana. And I just wanted to mention a little passage in it, and it basically talks about how, if you don't mind, may I just read a little sentence or two? It says, art is the province of every human being. It's simply a question of doing things, anything well. And when the artist is alive in a person, they become inventive, they enlighten, they open a way for better understanding. They open the book and show there's still more pages. They don't have to be a painter or a sculptor. They simply have to find the gain in the work itself. I thought just that really speaks to, the idea that you can be involved in any sort of discipline, but the creative impulse feeds that discipline. And that's so important. Yeah. Well, certainly with all the women that I've researched and painted.
Yeah, and again, today we can only obviously highlight things through this medium, through painting and so forth. But art, I mean, there's so many forms of art, and we're seeing more women stories shown in movies and theater. There's the visual art. There's all sorts of forms of art that can really be inspiring. I have to say I'm not very artistic. I do doodle, but I think even doodling or being out in nature, that I guess is my form of art. I love observing creatures and leaves and sort of everything out there in nature, but I'm not very creative myself. Okay, so we have a little bit of time and we will take some questions from the audience. So first question, Joe, are there other disciplines outside of STEM, I guess, where contributions of women have not been told?
Absolutely. Finance is the first one that comes to mind. I mean, that's math, but I think just about every discipline, there's been gaps left in our collective consciousness, simply because, as I said, we weren't the record keepers. So those histories weren't gathered and shared. So I would say across the board, yes.
And do you at some point vision expanding this project to beyond the women of STEM and into other areas, or and how do you also, I guess, speaking of other forms of creativity, do you see other people, whether it's in writing, in movie making, etc., seeing more of these stories being brought forward?
Absolutely. Well, so I do commissions and have different clients, and they can be in the field of law or medicine. I do collections in different fields. Finance, right now I'm working with a bunch of female venture capitalists. So, wherever a woman is working and digging into a male-dominated domain, there's an opportunity there to dig into the history of that domain and storytell around it. And you're absolutely right. The application of creative initiatives has really had an impact on STEM specifically. You mentioned Hidden Figures. NASA now has a program that jumps off, that sort of tags off that Hidden Figures program and goes into elementary schools with toolkits. It shows what the women have done historically, but also lets them, experiment and educate themselves in a way that has ended up, I think it's a 33%, NASA's seen a 33% increase in their female applications to the NASA internship. There's been, when there's a change in curriculum around storytelling about these women, or when there's picture books put into schools, you layer creativity onto history and it just becomes richer. And women in particular, it's been proven, really, really respond to art in the workplace, to portraiture in the workplace. I mean, if you want to create a culture that gives women a sense of belonging, there's a real opportunity there to, one woman, one wall, or to turn a boardroom space into a storytelling space that honors and shows what a company values in terms of women's contributions. Yeah, creativity always helps.
Yeah. Okay, another question from our audience. Is there a portrait story that surprised you or stood out amongst the others, and why?
One of them would be Mary Morgan. She came up with a jet fuel that helped get the first U.S. satellite into space. Nobody knew her story until it was her funeral, and her son was approached by these older men who had worked with her and said, basically, this is what your mother did, and nobody knows about it. So honestly, Aradhana, I could just, once we finish up here, open a book and find 5 more stories. Like, I will spend the last part of my life, I'm sure, digging into women's history and coming up with these stories, because it really runs deep. There's a tremendous reserve to pull from here. I'm trying to think of another story. Well, there's lots of them, but I love the story of Annie Jump Cannon, who I mentioned classified the first 400,000 stars. She came up with a code that, A, B, F, I forget the all letters, but
classification systems for stars.
Yes. And when I dig into why did she pick those letters to represent, the light that's emitted from stars, she used the phrase, "Oh, be a fine girl, kiss me." These, each one represents that letter. And I thought, there's a great story that a little girl's going to connect with and keep in her head and feed her imagination.
Absolutely. So another question is, do you find any difference between how men and women respond to your art?
Women respond much more strongly. They leave notes saying, could this collection of paintings please travel? Could you bring them into schools? Men will say, that's nice. It doesn't touch them. It doesn't resonate with them. But I honestly, every single time I've had a portrait show or done any sort of work around the project, it's been a real hunger, as I say, that I've seen that women have around their history. And it's lovely, because it's a common thread that women in all kinds of different disciplines and at all different levels, from senior executives to, the employees at all different levels, really feel connected on. So I think there's a beauty to that, women connecting around their untold history.
Another question. So what influence did your portraits have on your daughter? What is she up to now? What is she getting into?
Well, I mentioned Allison, your first guest, who I thought was wonderful, who I've been in touch with, and I loved her book as well. And I loved your podcast with her. And I think Julia's interest very much lays in the domain that Allison is in, around psychology and cognitive science and behavioral science. That seems to be the the field that most interests her. Yes. There's a lot of these paintings around the house, so she's she's exposed to them on a daily basis. So she has a pick of great women to be inspired by.
So she probably knows the stories of all these women just as well as you do.
I think so. I hope so.
Yeah. So, are you working with any book publishers to create books to give to put these portraits into a book and story and give visibility to that in children's education?
I'm not, but it's a great idea. I came across the book that I did for HarperCollins around the that first group of women's stories back in the dot-com days. And certainly all the research is there and the images are there. So that might be a great thing to do. Go back to HarperCollins and see who nibbles.
Okay, that's another project for you.
Yes, exactly.
How do you view the use of AI in creating art? And particularly when individuals use AI to visually express an idea or concept. How are you thinking of all the digital revolution that's happening?
Very much embracing it because the project has had a lot of success with not just women leaders, but primarily women leaders, and primarily in STEM, putting portraits in public and professional spaces in boardrooms and hallways and so on. But to reach that younger generation, I really think AI is the path forward. And so I've been working since December with engineers to integrate AI into the portraiture, and now we have a half dozen women talking to us through portrait, which is great. So we're going to find our way into science centers and possibly classrooms around that. And this year I'm going to focus on women pioneers in drug development and vaccine development, because there's some really rich stories there. And I'd love to use AI to talk about Dorothy Hodgkin and Gertrude Elion and Leon Farrell, as I mentioned. There's lots of great women to be brought to life by AI. Yeah.
Well, we have a lot of those in our company as well. As you may know, we developed the COVID vaccine during the pandemic, which saved millions and millions of lives, and we did that on a no profit basis. But it really the number of and again men and women within the company that contributed to that effort on top of their day jobs was really monumental. So big shout out again to all our colleagues who contributed to that effort. I know that was a very dark and difficult time for society, and your contributions are really appreciated. So another question: do you have any advice for our audience about how we can start changing perceptions about women in STEM? How do we take your mission, which you are doing through art, forward in other ways? Do you have any ideas?
Absolutely. I think I always think one woman, one wall. We have everybody has an infrastructure around them. Everybody has a world that they live in. Everybody went to an elementary school. Everybody, has a job, has a home. I now make because of that call from Vienna, they asked these women CEOs in the energy industry asked me if I'd not just do portraits but also do prints, and so now I do. One thing leads to another. Now I do prints, and they're out in the world. So I think that idea of hanging these women's images, putting a portrait in a waiting room. That's something we've been doing, moving into hospitals and medical schools so that they're integrated into your everyday life, so that you really do get to sort of see the faces and know the stories. I think that's a very important thing to do. And I think the AI piece around portraiture will help in terms of schools and science centers. That's basically storytelling and knowing those faces. As I say, when a girl closes her eyes to imagine a scientist or an inventor, if she can picture Elsie McGill, if she can picture Hertha, Alice Augusta Ball, you're on your way, with a sense of self-belief and ownership.
I mean, my advice on this topic would be, start with where you are, right? We all have a circle of influence in whatever work we're doing, right? In our families, in our workplaces, etc. There are people in and around us that we can influence. There's, it could be our church, could be our community, could be our homes, could be our extended families, and sharing the stories and starting there, like just start where you are, and you never know, a story that somebody hears from you, what impact that has on them. And so we all can play our role within the circle of influence that we're already in.
Totally agree. And I would also add that, pick the women who really speak to you because we're so focused on what we think, but you know, so much is what we feel, that has real power because that's what really comes through with people. They know when you're authentically storytelling and they absorb the energy of that and take it forward. So yes, I totally agree. Circle of influence, your immediate circle of influence. Yeah.
Well, this has been an incredible session. So I really want to thank you, Jo, for coming on this show, but also for everything that you do, for bringing these stories to light, for informing us, inspiring the next generation. I really hope that your project goes global, and more people join, and spread these stories to inspire the next generation. So thank you so much, and wish you all the very best.
Thank you so much for having me on.